Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's webinar with the ISE's Chief Research Officer, Tristram Hooley, who will be talking about the recent findings from our development survey. My name is Marina. I will be facilitating the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the question box, and we'll read them out to Tristram at the end of this session. That's it from me. Over to you, Tristram.
Okay, great. Well, it's really good to be able to come to you today and do a webinar on our recent student development survey. So hopefully I'm going to talk for around about half an hour, after which there's plenty of time for questions. So if you come up with any questions as you go along, then just pop them in the questions box and then we'll get to them at the end. So before I start on this talking about this survey, I just wanted to flag people's attention to the survey that we've got running at the moment, which is looking at the current situation with the coronavirus. And we're asking people, particularly employers, to have a look at that and to fill in how they're planning to respond to the coronavirus. So it's really important. It's just open for another day or so, so to midnight on Friday. And then we'll hopefully be coming back out to you with the findings of that, probably including another webinar either next week or the week after. So back to the development survey. So we recruited people onto the development survey in January and February, and we had 133 organisations respond, and that's about half of our eligible members. And if we look at how it breaks down by sector, we can see a sort of nice breakdown of different sectors, and it probably fairly closely represents what the ISE membership looks like. I've also broken it down by the number of hires that people are talking about, and then you can see it looks a little bit different. So some of the areas, particularly say finance and professional services, is actually accounting for a much bigger chunk of the response. And an area like legal, although we've got lots of firms, they tend to be on the smaller side, and so it's accounting for slightly less of a proportion of the overall number of students recruited. So if we go on and look at the students in aggregate, I asked people to tell us how many hires they had who they were in the process of developing in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And these are the answers we got. So we can see that there's a sort of steady increase in the number of both non-graduates, which is school leavers and apprentices in the main part, and graduates. But as you can see here, the numbers of the graduates have been going up rather quicker. Now, I'm not going to say too much about this today because I think it probably will be something that we'll come on to when we present our next survey. But we think that it's very likely that numbers are going to stop going up next year, and that's based both on our survey that we did at Christmas, the Pulse survey, and then on the kind of current survey that we're doing on coronavirus. But for now and for recent years, we've seen the numbers of hires that people in firms have had to sort of work with going up steadily year on year. So what I'm going to cover, this is basically, we'll follow the structure of the report. So we're going to look initially at managing development programs. They're then going to look at some of the development approaches that people are using, at the skills that we are talking about saying students have and don't have, issues of retention and progression, and then at some of the challenges. So starting with managing development teams, we've found that most firms are resourcing this area fairly seriously. So we've got a ratio of perhaps, so what we've done here is look at what a typical firm looks like. So we've got for every learning and development professional you have in your firm, each year you're going to recruit about 7 graduates and about 3 non-graduates like apprentices. So if you think about what that means, if you're a development professional, that means you're probably working with a ratio of something like 1 to 10 for every year who are on your early career program. So in most cases, as we'll see in a bit, that's typically a 2-year program. So probably we've got a situation where you've got 1 learning and development professional for every 20 hires who are on the early development program. Now, in addition to the actual members of staff you have working on this, most firms are also using external contractors, mainly who they're using to deliver training. And most are also using their line managers to support graduates and non-graduates. And one of the things we asked about is, are you actually training those managers to do that? And the overwhelming majority of firms are doing that. So if we then look at what people are spending every year, so for every new hire that you recruit, a typical firm is spending about, coming up for £6,000, so £5,739 on that hire throughout their first 2 years of time. So while they're on the program, so normally that will be over the first 2 years. In some cases, it might be slightly shorter or slightly longer. So what we can see from this is that employers are spending money, they're putting staff in place, and they're treating development programs quite seriously. We also asked in this section, where we're really asking about some of the more structural factors, is do you actually evaluate your program? How do you do that? And everybody pretty much said that yes, they did evaluate their program in some way. And then we asked, well, who do you ask for feedback from? We've got various different answers here. Basically, there was some really encouraging signs here, because it looked like people were seeking feedback from a very wide range of organizational stakeholders. They weren't very likely to be going out further than that to their customers and clients, but they would be talking to everybody really who was involved in the program in one way or another. If we then look at development approaches that people were actually using, so 98% of our respondents are running graduate programs. Most of these are quite specialist programs, so they tend to be recruiting, for example, people to move on to work in a finance function or an HR function. But a minority are also running more general programs where they're recruiting graduates and then perhaps rotating them around. 82% of our respondents are running non-graduate programs, and on average they're running about 13 standards. So it starts to give you a sense of how complex some of these programs are. It's not just a question of we have an apprenticeship program, but in fact we often are running multiple apprenticeship programs for different business functions. And then about a quarter of our respondents are also running school or college leaver programs that aren't apprenticeships. So in most cases, these are also running alongside the apprenticeship programs rather than as an alternative to them. So what we can see is that across our firms, we've got a very wide range of different early career activity going on. If we look at the apprenticeship side, we can see that people are recruiting a wide range of different types of apprenticeship, different levels of apprenticeship, ranging from level 2 up to level 7. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the high proportion of people who are recruiting at level 4, 5, 6, and 7, 58% of firms, so the majority of firms are saying that they're developing apprentices to do work that previously would have been done by graduates. Now, we're not really seeing that in the numbers so far, or we haven't been seeing that in the numbers so far, because although we've seen apprenticeships steadily going up, we've also seen graduate numbers going up. But we will keep watching that with some interest as we go forward. So turning to graduate programs, we can see that the typical graduate program is running for 2 years, and on average includes about 19 days training a year. In the first year that people start, they're probably doing an induction program that might last for 6 days, although those 6 days are not necessarily the first 6 days that they work for the firm. And if we look at then how people are going about training their different types of hires, we can see that there's quite a wide range of different approaches here. But some of the most popular are classroom learning, online learning, mentoring, encouraging peer support, and then this idea of rotation between business functions. And as you can see, the pattern is broadly quite similar for graduates and non-graduates, but there are some areas where there are important differences. So graduates are far more likely to do rotations, and graduates are far less likely to be given self-study time. However, if we then ask our employers which of these different approaches to training they think are most useful, most impactful, we get a slightly different answer. So the classroom learning still comes out top, but then we get this idea of experiential learning, or learning by doing, that moves right up there. Mentoring, encouraging peer learning support, and rotation between business functions. These are what people are thinking are the most effective approaches. So if we then look at how if we put those two sets of figures together, what this chart shows us is which tools are people using that they don't rate as impactful. So what we can see is that there are an awful lot of employers who are using online learning, but as we saw in the last slide, relatively few think that online learning is one of the most impactful approaches that they use. We've also got the issue of volunteering, which is slightly different because I think the training aspects of volunteering are somewhat secondary to its wider sort of corporate social responsibility functions. But then we've got another set of areas here which include mainly things which are around gaining external qualifications, which many employers are doing. Very few rate that process of accreditation and qualification as being one of the most impactful things that they're doing. And all of these kinds of issues throw up some issues that I think it's worth employers thinking about a bit more, about whether they're really investing the time and energy in the right kinds of training. So if we move on to look now at skills, we can look at some of the skills that employers are looking for. So if we look at the skills and attributes that employers are saying they need, we can see we've got a kind of quite a wide range. We ask about 25 different skills that we think employers might potentially be interested in. If we look, we've got a couple of areas where they're looking for more from non-graduates, from apprentices and school leavers, than they are from graduates. So they're the areas of dressing appropriately and IT and digital skills. And really, I think they're the things where these are kind of assumed for many firms, that these are going to come as normal, that you'll be able to know how to dress appropriately for work and so on. And with the non-graduates, this is more like a case of checking that these skills are in place. So if we look at what some of the most important things that employers are looking for, we've got things like teamwork, interpersonal skills, listening, problem solving, taking responsibility as some of the top issues there. If we look at what students lack, we can see that we've got a slightly different list, where things like managing up, commercial awareness, dealing with conflict, negotiation and influencing skills, job-specific technical skills, and career management start to be some of the most important things that employers are looking for, and that they feel that students are not having. If we look at some of the differences here, there are some areas where non-graduates are far more likely to lack these than graduates. So commercial awareness, career management skills, self-awareness, dressing appropriately, numeracy and teamwork. These are areas where there's quite a big difference between the amount of employers saying that non-graduates have them as opposed to graduates. However, 88% of our employers agree that students with work experience arrive with better skills than those who don't have work experience. So that's a really strong lesson to give to students, because if they can access some work experience, then they're probably going to be more appealing to employers than if they can't. Conversely, only about 15% of employers agree that more education, so a postgraduate degree, is going to give you better skills. Now, the ones that did agree with that tended to be in certain types of areas where actually, though, it made sense. So perhaps in engineering and IT and so on, where people might have a need for higher level qualifications. But in general, employers were not particularly persuaded that having additional postgraduate degrees necessarily was going to lead students to arrive with more skills. We then asked employers what they were spending their time developing, and we get, again, a third list, which is slightly different again. So they're spending their time developing presentation skills, commercial awareness, job-specific technical skills, teamwork, negotiating and influencing. So we're going to look at the relationship between these three questions of what are you looking for, what do students have, and what do students lack next. But for now, let's look at the differences between graduates and non-graduates here. So we've got a number of areas where graduates are really getting a lot more support than non-graduates. So employers are spending more time developing the negotiation and influencing skills, the leadership, the ability to deal with conflict, and the ability to manage up amongst graduates. So that's a really important subset of skills because they're ones that are really associated with organizational leadership. And so I think there's still a very clear sense that what people are training graduates on is still to become the future leaders of the organization. On the other hand, the things that we're more likely to train non-graduates on, staying positive, dressing appropriately, and numeracy, are kind of more basic things that we would want probably from all employees, and that perhaps address is some deficiencies that we need to address in non-graduates when they first arrive, as they're a little bit less mature, have a little bit less background and skills typically. On the other hand, overall, the differences are not that great between the graduates and non-graduates in terms of how the training programs are organized. So broadly, employers are running fairly similar training programs for both. So if we look at this, we're just focusing on the graduates for now. What I've done here is plot the proportion of employers recruiting for, saying students have, and providing training in different skills. Now, this chart and a very similar chart on non-graduates are available on our website as some interactive things, so you can have a bit more of a dig into these things. But what we can typically see is that as employers are more likely to train for something, students are unsurprisingly less likely to have it. So what this is telling us, I think, is that there are different things that employers train for, and there are different things that employers recruit for. Where students are weaker, employers are designing training to specifically address that. So we've got some categories of things here, really. So we've got this first area where we've got taking responsibility, self-awareness, business appropriate communication, and resilience. And in those cases, students have less of this than employers want it. So this is an area where we've got market shortages, effectively. We've then got a bunch of skills down the other end where employers aren't really very likely to recruit for these things, but they are important things that they spend time training students in. So they're things that employers don't look for initially, but they do value them in the workplace and spend time training them in. So we've got these kind of different categories of skills going on in the development program. So moving on, let's look a little bit at retention. Retention is very interesting because it tells us something about the overall well-being and satisfaction of hires. And what we can see here, so this chart shows if we start with the entry point, and we then ask people how many of your students, so at the entry point, 100% of your intake is still there. By the end of your program, how many are left? So typically a program is going to go on for about 2 years, as we've said, and we're seeing that both the graduates and non-graduates were in the kind of mid-80s at that point. So most of the people you recruit stay there throughout most of your first 2 years. By 3 years, it's starting to drop a bit, and we're also starting to see the gap open up between graduates who are a bit more likely to move on and non-graduates. And by the time we're 5 years in, we can see that about, in the high 50s, we've got the number of graduates, as opposed to the high 60s, we've got the number of non-graduates or apprentices. So what this tells us is that actually retention is pretty high. Most people who are employed by a firm on an early career entry point stay for 5 years. So the majority of both graduates and non-graduates stay for 5 years. But we also have some distinctions and differences between the graduates and the non-graduates. If we then break that down by sector, we can see that we've got some bigger variations there still. And so this one looks at graduates, and we can see that we've got, say, the digital and IT. It has some of the weakest retention. whereas I think it's energy and engineering has some of the best retention. And so these are some interesting, it's interesting things to think there's some variation. When we move on to look at the non-graduates, we have a slightly bigger variation, although I would be a little skeptical of this variation on the legal one, as it's not relating to very many firms here. So I think it's maybe only 1 or 2 firms there. But generally, we see the pattern that there are various sectoral variations in this. And so both the type of hire and the sector you work in is likely to have an impact on the level of retention that you have. Now, one of the things that we found that we thought was a little worrying in the current research was that about a quarter of firms said that they found it more difficult to retain women, and almost a fifth said they found it more difficult to retain Black, Asian or minority ethnic hires. And so there's clearly some issues there that we might want to dig into a bit further about some of the problems of diversity. And I think it's particularly important because a lot of the focus on diversity is focused on recruitment. And here we're moving to look a little bit more at retention and progression, and seeing that some of the problems that may appear to be solved at the entry point may pop up again in terms of inequitable treatment of some of these types of hires, and that may lead them to move on more quickly. But we need to understand more about why that's happening and what firms can do about it. So one of the things that we can see is why do staff actually leave? And we've got a number of different reasons here. We've ranked them. So career change is the most popular reason why staff are likely to leave. So over half of firms are saying that students are recruited and maybe making a career change after 2 or 3 years, and that's why they leave. But we also see people moving around within the sector that they're in, so poached by another company. Perhaps they're dissatisfied with their progression or pay, or unable to find the right role within the company. These things are also affecting it. So all of these things relate to career progression in some way. And although pay is clearly an issue, and I've got some statistics here which tell you how much a typical employee will increase during their first 3 years at the firm, in fact, pay is rarely coming up as one of the most common issues. It's much more of an issue that's wrapped in with wider sense of how early career hires are able to progress within the firm. So I think if we're thinking about what some of the implications of this might be, we're really thinking, how do we make our hires, the ones that we want to keep at least, how do we make them understand that within our firm, there is opportunities for them to progress, both in terms of salary, but also in terms of role, and that they're not going to get stuck here. And also to make them feel valued and so on. Now we've got a number of other reasons why people leave around family issues, mental health, seeking more socially valuable work and so on. But the biggest cluster of them are really kind of connected to this idea of career development and career advancement. And so that's really, I think, the area that firms might want to focus on. I'll break down the salaries a little bit more here, so that you can look at them. Again, this is available in the report and on our website as well. And what we've tried to do is look at what the average entry-level salary was for both graduates and non-graduates based on our research that we did in the summer. And then we compared it to what people say a typical salary would be 3 years in. And we can see that ISE employers are really offering their staff pretty good pay progression. So we're seeing very, very substantial uplifts in terms of pay and progression over the first 3 years of someone being employed. So it's very encouraging, very interesting. We'll keep watching these figures and see how they change. Finally, I'll just say a little bit about some of the challenges that people reported. So we asked what are some of the biggest challenges that you experienced? And by far and away, the biggest issue that people experienced above the line managers, above the attitude of the candidates or the candidates' actual skills or capabilities, was this issue of expectations and expectation management. So I think one of the big learning points out of this is that everybody's struggling with this issue of how do we get our hires to understand what work is going to be like, to understand what the opportunities, what the progression is going to look like, and how do we actually support them to develop their careers in a way that they feel meets their original expectation. And that raises all sorts of issues, some of which are outside of the immediate controls of people who are working in learning and development. So some of them are about how our colleagues in recruitment are selling these opportunities. Some of them get down to wider senses of how young people learn about work and build their ideas about what the workplace is going to be like. And all of these things need some further thinking, I think, as we start to try and address this. But this is the area that really came out strongly as the biggest challenge. So if you want more information on this, then all of our reports are available from this page, the publications page in our research area. And there's lots of information here that hopefully you'll find useful, but including the full report from the Student Development Survey. So in summary, I think development programs remain as an important part of the practice of student employers. They're well resourced and well established in most firms. Firms are using a wide range of techniques to deliver development programs, but they're sometimes relying on approaches that they don't believe are particularly impactful. And that seems to be an area that people really might want to think about more. There are some clear patterns in the skills that employers are looking for, that students have and that employers are training for. Retention is generally pretty high, but there are some diversity issues to attend to. And managing candidates' expectations is one of the biggest issues that firms face. So my contact details are here. If you want to ask me any further questions, absolutely available to do that. But in the meantime, we'll flag up this opportunity for you to look at our coronavirus survey for the next couple of days, if you've got time to fill that in. Otherwise, I'm happy to take some questions now.
Thank you, Tristram. As Tristram mentioned, if you recruit early career staff, please follow the link in the chat and complete our short survey on coronavirus. And yeah, so this is your opportunity to ask Tristram any questions. And currently we have one question from Vicky Newhouse, Tristram. Is the cost per graduate including recruitment costs?
No, so we've also got figures. So if I go back to that cost per graduate figure, so the cost per graduate, this is a development cost. So the recruit, we also have figures for recruitment. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. I think it's about £3,000 worth of recruitment per hire that firms are spending. But this is once you've actually recruited them. And what I think people are generally including in these figures are more non-pay costs. So this is costs for trainers, for putting on training courses, perhaps for paying for qualifications amongst those firms where they're paying for qualifications, and so on. So these are the kinds of figures that we're talking about.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions, but perhaps let's give it another minute or two. And in the meantime, I just would like to remind that all our webinars are recorded. So this webinar will be available on our website, hopefully by the end of the week. And in upcoming weeks, we will have plenty more webinars and podcasts coming up. So if you haven't already listened to our podcast, we have recorded 2 episodes. So you can have a look on our website, have a look at our previous webinars, and yes, we have plenty of interesting information on our website. I have another question, Tristram. On the development team slide, are the L&D teams team members dedicated to youth programs or more general LAD?
No, so the question that we asked was how many of your learning and development, how many full-time equivalents do you have looking at early careers? So this is not, well, and as it shows on the slide, this is both for the graduate side and for the non-graduate. So this might include an apprenticeship manager, a graduate development manager, and we've then tried to make an estimate of what the kind of ratio of that is, and we've come up with this figure of around about 1 to 20 as being a sort of a typical ratio. But of course, it varies quite a lot by different firms, and so in some firms we might see much lower numbers, and in others much higher numbers.
Another question from Jane. Is there any data showing the trends on retention over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I have looked at this. Retention has actually stayed. I actually plotted, and I may share this as a blog or something at some point. One of the things that I'm always sort of looking at is whenever I do these reports, I usually try and look at how things are changing. But I don't tend to report that unless it looks like there's a kind of an interesting trend or shift. So if you remember back to our recruitment survey, we've talked about some of the issues that are going on with overall salary, which is sort of broadly that there's some trends that in real terms that's gone down. But in terms of things like retention, what we see is actually a remarkable amount of stability. Now, it looks like possibly the level of graduate retention has dipped a little bit at the kind of 5-year point this year, but I think overall we're seeing quite a lot of the retention has stayed quite high for both graduates and non-graduates, and it stayed quite high at a fairly similar level for about 10 years. Now, obviously, we could look back further and look pre-crash, and it may well be that there is a different pattern pre-crash when the economy was a bit more bullish. But yeah, we've seen a lot of stability in this issue over the last 10 years.
Thank you. And the last question, or more of a comment really, from Gail. I'm assuming the value and delivery of online learning is going to evolve now and potentially will change to people seeing how we can do it and how it can be valuable.
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit when I presented this. Somebody asked this sort of question at the conference that we held the other day, and I think one of the things that I absolutely believe, and I'm someone who's been involved in online learning for a number of years, is that online learning can be hugely valuable. And so we're absolutely not saying here that online learning is not valuable. And I think what's happening at the moment with the coronavirus is really focusing everyone's mind on how important it is likely to be. Having said that, what our data tells us is that while most firms have invested in online learning, most learning and development professionals who are filling in this survey are not convinced that this is one of the most effective approaches. And I think that's really, I would see that as a challenge, and a particularly apposite challenge at the moment to learning and development professionals to try and really understand how they can make more use of online learning and really make it work more effectively. So yeah, I think it's a really important point to make, is that what I'm seeing with online learning and with some of the other areas is some areas where the ISE membership are doing them, but they're not yet convinced about the value of them in comparison to more traditional approaches. I think the question is either we've got to make these things work more effectively, which I absolutely believe we can, or we've got to think about whether we're really emphasizing the right types of approaches. So that's my thoughts on the online learning question.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is the last question from Liz. Will there be a copy of these slides? So we are recording this webinar, so the audio, the entire session will be available on our website, but also you can read our report in full on our website. Tristram, would you mind sharing a link to the report, please?
Yeah, so the link to the report is at the end. It's on our publication page, so here you go. But I'm also happy to share the slides from this, so perhaps we can also post the slides so that if people need to download them and use them. Mainly, it's a pretty straight. This presentation has pretty much been straight. It's a pretty much straight telling of the story that's in the survey. There's also obviously a lot more detail in the survey and some issues that I didn't really have time to address today. So if you're interested in this, then absolutely download the survey. But if you want, we can share the slides as well.
Perfect. We actually had a couple more questions coming in. So one from Adi. On the 82% of employer-running non-grad programs, what do you mean by 13 standards? Are they running 13 at the same time?
Yeah, so so one of the things that we asked with this question is we're saying how many different types of apprenticeships are you running, essentially? So that's what the standards relates to. So I'm just trying to find this. Here we go. Right. So yeah, 82% of employers are running these non-graduate programs, which are usually apprenticeships. In most cases, they're apprenticeships, and they're typically running 13 standards. So when I did some interviews with a number of employers about this time last year, when we looked at how employers were actually embedding apprenticeship programs, and what we saw was, particularly in larger firms, you might have multiple apprenticeship programs. So you might, for example, have a marketing apprenticeship running at the same time as you've got an engineering one, at the same time as you've got an IT one in your IT department, and so on. And you also, in another thing which is in the report but I haven't reported here, is that for large firms that were operating across a large geographical area, they may also be running slightly different things in slightly different areas or regions, depending on the nature of their business there. So they're probably working with different learning providers. So yes, this is very much a case, I think, and something to bear in mind, is that while that's true also to some extent of the graduate programs, the apprenticeship programs are much more diverse. They're typically involving smaller numbers, and so they're basically more complicated to organize, because people are running lots of different types of apprenticeship programs with usually fairly small numbers on each of them across the range of their business.
Thank you. Ashley has a question about online learning. It would be useful to understand specifically what is meant by online learning. For example, just flipping through reading and mini tests, or video lectures and engagement.
Yeah, so we have some other categories there which are worth just pointing out to you. So we've used this term online learning as a sort of generic catch-all, but we've also got things here like gamified learning, micro learning, and so on. But no, we don't have a lot of detailed breakdown about exactly what people are doing. And I suspect if we went into that, we might find that there are some things which are extremely kind of thorough and detailed implementations of online learning with lots of multimedia and interactivity, and others that are just kind of repositories of information. I mean, I do take the point, and that might be something that we could break down a bit more in the future. I think that is an interesting point.
Thank you. And Isabella asks, who does qualify as an entry-level candidate for recruiters?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Sure. Who does qualify as an entry-level candidate for recruiters?
Who actually? So this category we've got, which is sort of entry-level candidates. Well, our sort of historic understanding of this was graduates. So we said anybody who's coming straight into an employment from a university. We then, a few years ago, broadened it out to also include apprentices, because we said, well, there's lots of firms that are creating that route of apprentices. But as we found, there are quite a large number of firms that were also bringing in school leavers or college leavers, but not onto an apprenticeship. So we include those as well. So I leave it actually ultimately up to the respondents to define exactly what they mean by entry level, because normally what we're talking about is people who this job is their first or at least a very early destination after they've left the education system.
Great, thank you. One more question. Are employers reflecting on how digitalization may impact their work? Did I see over 50% of employers require digital skills? And what do employers call or view as digital skills? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so we know, not just from this work, but from our previous studies, that employers, are very keen on digital skills, and one of the areas of shortage that they're struggling with is finding people who are programmers and high-level IT users. I think that's quite different from what we're asking about here, which is more, I think, the kind of routine IT and digital skills that we would expect a worker in a business to have. And so I think it's important for us to make those distinctions. So while many employers are looking for, let's say, IT skills or data handling skills or skills with Excel and so on, and they want students to have those things, generally they're fairly positive about those things and are able to find them. So if we look at the next slide, we've got what students lack, and we see, the data handling, IT skills fall pretty low down this list. So generally, employers are pretty happy with the kind of data and IT skills that students come with. However, they are looking for a certain set of high-level IT and analytical skills, and they're not able to find enough of those. And that's what we reported in our recruitment survey.
Perfect. Thank you, Tristram. I think that's all the questions.
Great. Thank you for all the questions, everyone.
Yes, very engaging today. Yes, thank you, Tristram, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in this difficult time. Again, the recording of this webinar will be available on our website. You can also read our report online, and we will also publish the slides on our website. Again, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day and the weekend.